Today, we are going to be reading When the World Ended, Sherman's March to the Sea, and the Surrender at Appomattox, 1865. There's the picture. Emma Florence LeConte lived in Columbia, South Carolina. Emma had been 13 when Fort Sumter fell. So do you remember Fort Sumter was the very first battle where there was actually no real fighting because the Union soldiers were allowed to leave. So she was 13 when Fort Sumter fell. The joy, the excitement, how well I remember it, the girl wrote in her diary. We women ran trembling to the veranda, to the front gate, eagerly asking news of the passers-by. The whole town was in a joyful tumult. That means they were all very excited. Now Emma was 17. What 4 long years of war had meant, she could reduce to a single sentence. No pleasure, no enjoyment, nothing but rigid economy and hard work, nothing but the stern realities of life. At first, the gallant Lee had done so well, and then, with the early summer of 1863, the terrible change had come. On July 3rd, the smashing Northern victory at Gettysburg. The very next day, the humiliating defeat for the South at Vicksburg. Since then, the Confederacy had fought on, but Emma could not be fooled. The world of the South was ending. Lee fell back before Grant in Virginia. That Sherman wrecked Atlanta and marched across Georgia to Savannah, destroying all in his path. Even the hope for an honorably negotiated peace between North and South seemed dim to Emma. A sea rolls between them and us, a sea of blood. Grim, gray, cold January of 1865 settled upon Columbia. Emma looked at her unbleached homespun frock, her coarse stockings, her crude shoes of calfskin, and thought that before the war, she had given away better clothes to her slaves. Now calico sold for $16 a yard. Truly, only the extortioner in the South gained anything from the years of war. Some nights a haze hung over the moon. Fears grew stronger then. Sherman, who once had boasted he would bring every Southern woman to the washtub, would turn next on South Carolina. The North rued South Carolina, since it was the first state to secede from the Union. Was William Tecumseh Sherman the brutal genius of destruction that the South believed him to be? It was true that all his life he had disliked his red hair, and once had tried to dye it, only to have his head turn a hideous shade of green. But otherwise he had been like any other boy growing up in Ohio. At 16, he had entered West Point, and afterward had spent 4 years at an army post in Charleston. He had loved the South, said that his happiest years before the war were spent here, and at the outbreak of hostilities had been superintendent of the Louisiana Military College in Alexandria. No one wanted less than Sherman to see the war come. Men are blind and crazy, he told his daughter Minnie. Sherman did not fight to free the slaves. He fought to save the Union. Sherman bore no grudge against the South. He simply denied its right to secede and intended to keep on fighting till it gave up that right, even if, as he expected, the war took 20 years. Grant and Sherman were a team. Perhaps this fact, as much as any, accounted for the military success that came to the North after the summer of 1863. Once, when Grant had been severely criticized and had threatened to resign from the army, Sherman had persuaded him to change his mind. Afterward, the two generals fought side by side at Vicksburg. There they learned a new kind of war. Previously, it had been believed that before an army could move into battle, it must first establish a base of supplies and protect the highways, railroads, and rivers by which those supplies could be moved up to the fighting front. At Vicksburg, however, Grant abandoned his base and decided to live off the country as he moved. This surprise fooled the Confederates, permitted Grant to interpose his forces between two rebel armies, and wrest the victory that ultimately gave the North control of the Mississippi River. So this is saying that in the past, when armies would come, before they would begin fighting, they would establish their base so that all the supplies like food and ammunition could be brought to the fighting front. But Grant decided that rather than set all of that up, he would just have his soldiers eating food from the farms nearby and getting what they needed right there. And so that freed them up to be able to move quickly, and they could fight two different Southern armies at the same time. And that caught the Southerners by surprise and led to a victory. The emergence of Grant at Vicksburg as a great general led to his appointment as supreme commander of the Northern armies. He conferred with his old friend Sherman, whom Grant considered as fine a general as the Union had, and together they planned the 1864-1865 campaign to end the war. The plan itself was called the Anaconda Policy, after the anaconda snake that squeezes its victim to death. While Grant drove Lee's army before him toward the Confederate capital of Richmond, Sherman's army jumped off from Chattanooga and, living off the country, raced along the edge of the mountains to Atlanta. Later had come the idea of the march to the sea, by which Sherman sought to get behind Lee and catch him in the jaws of a gigantic military nutcracker. So to have Grant on one side and Sherman on the other, and just like a nutcracker. For 6 weeks, dashing across Georgia, Sherman and his army simply disappeared, cutting off all communication with the world until they reached Savannah. Sherman's army, Grant said, resembled a ground mole. You can hear, here and there, trace his track, but you are not quite certain where he will come out until you see his head. In Columbia, however, Emma LeConte made no allowance for the possibility that Sherman's movements fitted a predictable military pattern. The fear that Sherman planned a special devastation for South Carolina grew like a hard core within her. Then on St. Valentine's Day, Emma knew the truth. What a panic the whole town is in. I have not been out of the house myself, but Father says the intensest excitement prevails on the streets. It is true, some think Sherman will burn the town, but we can hardly believe that. I have been busily making large pockets to wear under my hoop skirt. They will hardly search our persons. So they're preparing to flee, and she's going to take her treasures with her in hidden pockets underneath her big skirt, assuming that the soldiers won't search the women's bodies. Sherman's army continued to advance on Columbia. Terror mounted within the city. Then, on the 17th of February, the Yankees were there, before them flying a panic-stricken crowd of women and children who seemed crazy. At the window, Emma watched the Confederate flag pulled down from the State House and the flag of the United States raised. She turned away, weeping. General Sherman insisted that he gave no orders to burn the city that night, but Southerners continued to blame him for the fire that destroyed their home. About 7 o'clock in the evening, Emma stood on the back porch of her home. Below her, she said, the whole southern horizon was lit up by campfires which dotted the woods. Elsewhere, pink light touched the skies. Some houses had been fired. With the passing of another hour, the wind howled in a gale. So a strong wind blew. Flames jumped from house to house, and suddenly Columbia was wrapped in one huge blaze. Emma drew a picture of the terrorizing scene. Imagine night turning into noonday, only with a blazing, scorching glare that was horrible. Let me get closer for the picture. A copper-colored sky across which swept columns of black rolling smoke, glittering with sparks and flying embers, while all around us were falling thickly showers of burning flakes. Everywhere, the palpitating blaze walled the streets as far as the eye could reach, filling the air with its terrible roar. On every side, the crackling and devouring fire, while every instant came the crashing of timbers and the thunder of falling buildings. A quivering, molten ocean seemed to fill the air and sky. The library opposite us seemed framed by the gushing flames and smoke, while through the windows gleamed the liquid fire. 3 days later, Sherman's army pushed north, leaving behind 366 burned acres, 1,386 homes and stores in ruins. In Virginia, Lee fought as valiantly as ever, but his army was greatly reduced in size, and strategically Grant laid siege to Petersburg-Richmond. Grant's goal was only 21 miles away. On April 1st, a Union cavalry force under Little Phil Sheridan defeated the rebels in the Battle of Five Forks. Grant pushed his attack on Petersburg, and when the brave defense of that city crumbled, drove Lee in hopeless retreat, while the Yankees entered Richmond. At the end of that day, Lee was heard to confess, "Then there is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." So on April 9th, Grant and Lee met at Appomattox Courthouse to arrange the surrender of Lee's Confederate forces. Lee, who had been courageous in victory, now could be noble in defeat. Confederate soldiers choked up at the sight of this kindly, understanding leader, whom they called with affection Uncle Robert. Lee, dressed in his best uniform, including a scarlet silk sash, mounted his horse, whose name was Traveler, and proceeded solemnly to the meeting place. Grant entered, and the two men shook hands. "I have come to meet you here, General Grant, to ask upon what terms you would accept the surrender of my army." Grant graciously and generously stated that the officers and men might go home on parole, and that they might keep their arms and horses. This was as President Lincoln would have it. "There is just one thing," Lee said. "Our privates in the cavalry also own their horses." "In that case," said Grant, "all the men who claim to own a horse or mule may take it home with them to work their farms." "That will have a very happy effect," said Lee. The men walked to the porch, and Lee mounted his horse. Grant raised his hat in salute to Lee. The Virginian raised his hat also. The Union was preserved. The slaves were free. The time of malice was over, and with charity and goodwill, the nation would be rebuilt. Sadly, President Lincoln, who had paid so dearly to preserve the Union, fell to an assassin's bullet on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender. And that's the end.